What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the September 2018 format. We just had 3 of the largest YCS events ever to take place come to a close, and with the new Forbidden and Limited list in effect, this is cool because this is the first set of major events that really give us a glimpse and some insight into how the format is going to shape up and progress. And with so much data to mine through, there's a lot to discuss. But before we get into it, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss a single video. And if you guys love these meta-analyses as well as the rest of my content, consider becoming a YouTube channel member to get your Cimoooooooo badge next to your name in the comments, or consider backing me on Patreon for even greater rewards. Be sure to hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So I decided I'm actually going to break this meta-analysis up into 2 separate videos because we had 3 large events take place and there's so much to discuss that I'm going to take the time in this first video to talk about kind of the main meta contenders and what we expected to do well, but in the second video I'm going to discuss more of the rogue decks that kind of showed up and kind of the effect that they might have on the format moving forward. So we're going to talk strictly meta in this video, which it is the meta-analysis, so I guess that's appropriate. But we're going to start off with YCS Columbus. YCS Columbus had over 2,700 competitors, one of the largest YCS events we've ever had, and here's the pie chart for the top 64, not 32. Typically it's a top 32, but because there were so many players at all of these tournaments, it actually broke down to a top 64 cut, and this is what that top 64 looked like. And by looking at this, we see that Sky Striker was the dominant deck, taking up about 42% of the top cut slots. And you know, I think a lot of people expected this. In my top 5 meta decks of this format, I expected Sky Striker to either be the best deck or the second best deck, but obviously showing by the results here, it is without a doubt the best deck going into this format. And why is that? Well, if we take a look back at the Forbidden and Limited list, the only hit the deck really got was Sky Striker Hornet Drones going to 1, and realistically when it comes to the Sky Striker deck, that doesn't really matter. I mean, we've seen in the OCG, they've also gotten Sky Striker Hornet Drones limited to 1, and that deck is still the best deck in the format. Now, granted, their format is different. They have stuff like Needle Fiber, so it's definitely a different format, but it just goes to show that there are some parallels between the OCG and TCG, and losing those 2 copies of Hornet Drones really didn't affect the pure Sky Striker variant at all. The deck still has plenty of ways to access Sky Striker Ray, and realistically, as long as you can get to a copy of Ray or a copy of Engage, you should be perfectly fine because that's going to get your engine going. And you've got so many consistency cards. I think in the main versions of these decks, they have about 10, 11, maybe 12 ways to access Ray. And in a 40 card deck, especially when you have another, plethora of cards that can basically tutor into these cards, then it really isn't too difficult to get your engine going. What I really love about the pure Sky Striker build though is it can just outgrind so many other different decks in pretty much every scenario. Yeah, it has a low damage output, but the fact that you're able to just like 1 for 2 so many of your opponent's cards mean you can easily out-resource them, and it's really not difficult to take control of the game when you're playing a Sky Striker deck. A lot of decks just don't have the capability or the tools to really gain that much value that Sky Striker does, or even recur that level of value as well. I mean, if you look at each of their individual pieces, there's so much advantage to be gained, especially once you get 3 spell cards in the graveyard, that it just starts spiraling out of control, and there's really no way for you to make a comeback. Now, I did mention their low damage output, but honestly, Borrelsword Dragon being released in Cybernetic Horizon really gave the deck a boost because now it has a way to output a lot more damage than it was able to before. It's still a bit difficult to make it in a deck like pure Sky Striker, but that's why we've seen players tech something like Phantom Skyblaster just to get the extra tokens to be able to make Borrelsword Dragon a lot easier and close out games a lot quicker. You also have to realize that on the Forbidden and Limited list, Goki had its power curbed pretty hard. I mean, with Nightmare Goblin being banned, as well as MX Saber Invoker and a couple other hits as well, Goki definitely took a hit, but it basically gave way to Sky Striker Pure being the dominant deck, and you're going to see that kind of proliferate into the other events as well. Speaking of Goki though, Goki also made a good showing at YCS Columbus, taking up about 23% of the top 64 cut. Now, there is a big caveat here because here in America, we do have Summon Sorceress. Now, Summon Sorceress is basically the reason why Goki is still as viable as it is, and you're going to see that when we get into the results from Utrecht as well as Mexico City, Goki is not going to perform nearly as well because depending on the region that you're playing, whether or not Summon Sorceress is legal, it's definitely going to affect how you need to plan to counteract a specific metagame, because with Goki basically taking up 1/5 of the slots in top cut, that means if you're going to any other competitive event moving forward, we have another YCS just coming up in a few weeks, that Summon Sorceress plays a very vital role here. Now, I personally believe that Goki was still going to be the strongest deck. I did not think that Goblin and MX Saber Invoker were enough to curb the power of the deck to stop it from being the best deck. Clearly I was wrong, but at the same time, it's still the second strongest deck where Summon Sorceress is legal, and so that's definitely something you need to keep in mind because it can still extra link with 2 cards, and granted, Pure Sky Striker still has plenty of power behind it. If you're going up against an extra linked board, it's still very difficult to overcome that sometimes. Now, with the banning of Nightmare Goblin, these extra link boards have become much more susceptible to cards that target, but don't necessarily destroy, so cards like Widow Anchor, which is a 3 of in Sky Striker, cards like Mind Control, Enemy Controller, Infinite Impermanence, anything that basically targets and negates effects or can possibly break a U-Link really makes Goki much more, susceptible to these types of cards. So something you definitely have to keep in mind, but Goki's still a threat where Summon Sorceress is legal and something you really need to be cognizant of. Next up is Altergeist. Now, Altergeist took up about 9% of the top cut here, and as we're going to see in some of the later pie charts, Altergeist is a pretty solid third place contender for this format. Now, I had higher hopes for Trickstar variants just because Trickstar Sky Striker, even with the limitation of Hornet Drones, is still a very explosive deck, but with a lower representation of Trickstar, I feel like Altergeist was actually able to do better because that's kind of Altergeist's worst matchup. Altergeist has a very good Sky Striker matchup because it's able to grind with Pure Sky Striker, and as we've seen in the OCG, it's their second best deck and seeing a lot of representation kind of in tandem with the Pure Sky Strikers as well, and so it's a pretty solid pick. Also, again, with the banning of Nightmare Goblin, you got a lot of your targeting effects back online, which means it's a lot easier to break the Goki players' boards, and Altergeist is just a pretty solid deck. It's just one of those decks that's really never had its opportunity to shine, but I think it's a pretty solid third place contender moving into this next format. Other than that, though, we've also had Draco and Trickstar taking up about 5 to 8% each. I thought Trickstar was going to do a lot better, but obviously it shows that I was wrong there as well, but it still shows that it's a threat that you're going to have to deal with. Sure, you may only play 1 or 2 Trickstar variants at, whatever competitive event you might be competing at, but it's still there. It has not gone away, and it's still very explosive. I mean, you've got the time rules on your side. The deck is very aggressive. It can adapt to formats, and who knows, maybe we'll see a more pure, stun variant of Trickstar appear just because it can play Floodgates if it wants, especially now that the meta is a bit more defined, and Draco is still doing what Draco does best. I think it kind of fell from its, solid tier 2 spot. Altergeist might be slightly overtaking it, but Draco still made a very good showing, not only just at YCS Columbus, but Utrecht and Mexico City as well. Speaking of those other events, though, let's be sure to give those events some love as well. Let's go ahead and move across the Atlantic to Utrecht. Now, Utrecht had, I think it was over 2,300 players, making it the largest YCS that Europe has ever had. That is so awesome. And again, looking at the top 64 breakdown here, we're seeing a little bit more of the same with Sky Striker, not even just being as dominant as it was at Columbus, but even more so. I think it took up 55% of the top cut, so that's over half the slots in top cut were dedicated to Pure Sky Striker. So this is where you're going to start to see the effect of Summon Sorceress and how it plays a role in the format, because with Summon Sorceress gone, you're seeing a much lower representation of Goki, and since Goki was actually in second place at Columbus, now you don't really have another solid solid deck that can really go toe-to-toe with pure Sky Striker, and that's why we're seeing such an overwhelming dominance of the deck at YCS Utrecht. Now, we still did have Goki. It took up about, I think, like 12.5%, so like 1/8 of the top cut, so that's not bad. It obviously goes to show Goki is playable without Summon Sorcerers, but comparing this to Columbus, you see that Summon Sorcerers' power is basically that important to the deck, but you still can play Goki if you want. It's just a lot more difficult, and honestly probably not as advised by comparison. Altergeist still hanging in there at 3rd place though, taking up about 8% of the top cut, so again, you still goes to show that the deck is still definitely viable, especially I think the more we start to see Sky Striker become more popular, I think Altergeist is going to follow that trend. Draco and Trickstar, again, still right behind there, taking up, you know, a little bit of a smaller percentage, but basically that's going to be your meta. And finally, wrapping it up with YCS Mexico City. I think YCS Mexico City had over 2,600 people. Again, I think making it one of the largest YCSs they've ever had and just ever to take place in general. But again, we see this top 64 breakdown. Sky Striker, Sky Striker, Sky Striker is the name of the game. And I think it took up like 52%. So again, over half of the top cut slots went to Sky Striker. And that's just insane. Again, just showing the power that, you know, Summon Sorcerers has in bringing Goki up on these lists. Goki was like one of the lowest represented decks when it came to YCS Mexico City. I think it only took up like maybe 5% of their top cut. I think it was like the 5th most represented deck. Here we saw a little bit more Trickstar, kind of going to show that Trickstar is still a viable option. I think it took up like maybe 8 of the top cut slots, so not too bad. But we also still had Altergeist and Draco hanging in there as well. Just going to show that we're going to have this meta that's completely dominated by Sky Striker, with a couple other decks like Goki, Draco, Altergeist being able to hang in there. What's going to happen moving forward, though, is now that Sky Striker has pretty much established itself as the strongest deck of the format, you're going to start to see players adapt their strategies quite significantly. Anyone wanting to play Sky Striker is going to basically build their deck to beat the mirror match, because based off these results, Sky Striker is going to be everywhere. You really need to take that into account if you're going to any competitive event, because probably half the matches you're going to play are going to be against Sky Striker, especially the higher you go into the top tables. So if you're not prepared for that matchup, whether it's a mirror match or if you're playing something to counter the deck, that's going to be a very bad time. However, there's going to be the other decks like Goki, like Trickstar, like Draco, that are going to play more anti, you know, Sky Striker hate in order to counteract that matchup and make it a little bit easier. Like if they weren't playing Imperial Order already, they definitely will be now. Same thing goes for Anti-Spell Fragrance. Basically any card that just shuts down the entire deck is going to be an auto include for these decks, because they're already at a disadvantage being a lot weaker and maybe even less consistent. So these decks are going to need all the power they can get to basically bring Sky Striker down to their level to even have a chance. So this is going to be interesting, and Soul Fusion isn't too far away, and we have Thunder Dragons going to be mixed into this as well. And Thunder Dragons have a pretty decent Sky Striker matchup, so we'll have to see how the meta goes from there. Be sure to stay tuned though for the second part of this meta analysis, where we go more in depth for the rogue side of things. A lot of really cool decks popped up, and there's a lot I want to discuss with that as well. Like a certain deck in particular that really doesn't want to die. But guys, that's going to do it for this first part of the meta analysis. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this meta analysis and what you thought about these events overall. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this informative, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or backing me on Patreon, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.